In 2025, U.S. trade policy did a complete 180, and it basically rewrote the rules for how America does business with the world. This massive wave of new tariffs sent a shockwave that started in international ports and traveled right into our homes. So today we're going to trace that shockwave, all the way from the initial policy decision to the price you pay for, well, just about everything.
So just how big of a shock are we talking about? Well, in early 2025, the average U.S. tariff on imports just skyrocketed, going from only 2.5% to an estimated 27%. Now, to put that in perspective for you, that is a level of tax on foreign goods that the U.S. hadn't seen in over 100 years. We're talking since the days of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that made the Great Depression even worse.
All right, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the big policy shakeup and the playbook they used to do it. Then, we're going to follow the ripple effects, first through our supply chains, then the wider economy, and finally, how it hits the price in your pocket. And to wrap it up, we'll see how the rest of the world decided to hit back.
Okay, so first things first, let's set the stage. What went down in 2025 wasn't just some minor adjustment. No, this was a huge, historic pivot toward protectionism that basically tore up decades of U.S. trade policy.
The administration's moves were super fast and incredibly broad. Tariffs were slapped on a massive range of products from almost every single country. I mean, this wasn't some surgical strike on one or two industries. It was a blanket policy that created an instant nightmare for any business that relied on, a global supply chain.
So how in the world did this actually happen? Let's dive into the specific policies and the, let's say, creative legal justifications that made up this new trade strategy. This was the playbook that turned their goals into a reality. At the very heart of this new strategy was something called the reciprocal tariff. The whole idea was to match U.S. tariff rates to the trade deficit we have with another country. But this formula was controversial, to say the least. Most economists will tell you that a trade deficit isn't a simple scorecard of who's winning at trade. It's way more complicated than that.
So here's how it all played out. It kicked off with a universal 10% baseline tariff on pretty much everything coming in. But that was just the start. On top of that, a lot of countries got hit with those even higher reciprocal tariffs. And to justify such a sweeping move, the administration used the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, in a way nobody had ever seen before. And this was all piled on top of existing tariffs on stuff like steel and cars.
And if you look at the timeline, you can see just how chaotic this whole thing was. On April 2nd, the so-called Liberation Day tariffs are announced, and they immediately send shockwaves through the global economy. The market reaction was so bad that just a week later, they had to pause the higher tariffs. But that was only a temporary break. By August 7th, new, revised tariffs were right back on the table.
So now, let's trace that first major ripple effect, the immediate, absolute scramble this created for businesses everywhere. The policy might have been cooked up in Washington, but believe me, the impact was being felt in ports and warehouses all over the world.
This quote from Maersk, one of the biggest shipping companies on the planet, really says it all. In a note to their clients, they weren't talking about big economic theories. They were talking about avoiding fees you get when your container sits on the dock for too long. It was a logistical nightmare, and the advice was brutally simple. Get organized or it's going to cost you.
And here are the actual steps Maersk was recommending. It gives you a real sense of the chaos. They were telling businesses to get their paperwork done ASAP, schedule pickups the second cargo was available, and even to return empty containers faster, just to keep the ports from grinding to a halt. This was not business as usual. This was a supply chain under unbelievable stress.
And from the ports, that stress started to spread everywhere, to the entire U.S. economic. This is that second big ripple, how these tariffs started to mess with our country's growth, jobs, and inflation.
The numbers started to tell a pretty clear story, and fast. The Federal Reserve saw what was coming and slashed its GDP growth forecast. Inflation, which had been getting better, suddenly started ticking back up as all those imported goods got more expensive. And the job market, especially in manufacturing, started to get shaky, with unemployment climbing higher than it had been since 2021.
And this wasn't just some temporary blip either. Forecasts for 2026, like this one from the Colorado State Planning Office, show that inflation was expected to stay way above the Federal Reserve's 2% target. That was a huge red flag, signaling a long-term pressure on prices.
And what if the trade war got even worse? Well, the forecasts got a whole lot uglier. In that scenario, U.S. inflation was projected to jump all the way to 4.2%. This shows you that direct line between a trade policy and your cost of living, with a very real chance of long-term economic pain if things kept escalating.
Okay, So this brings us to the most direct ripple effect of all, the one that really matters to everyone. Let's connect the dots from all that abstract economic data to the very real price in your pocket.
So where are these price hikes actually coming from? This chart here breaks it down perfectly. It shows which things we buy are most dependent on imports. And look at the top of the list: medicines, new cars, clothes, and electronics. When you slap a steep tariff on all those items, you can be pretty sure the price you pay at the pharmacy, the car dealership, or the mall is going to go up.
And it's not just about what we buy, it's also about what we sell. Take a look at Colorado's agriculture sector, for example. In just the first half of 2025, because other countries hit back with their own tariffs, meat exports fell by almost $39 million. That translated to about 265 people losing their jobs and an $80 million hit to the state's economy. This is the real-world cost of a trade war.
But of all the numbers we've looked at, this next one might be the most jaw-dropping. A study by the Penn-Wharton budget model calculated the projected lifetime loss in what a middle-income household can afford to buy because of these tariffs. The grand total? A staggering negative $22,000. That is the long-term price of this policy, paid by ordinary families.
Okay, for our final piece of the puzzle, let's zoom out and look at the global ripple effect. The US didn't do this in a vacuum. Let's see how the rest of the world reacted to this dramatic change in American trade policy.
The response was swift and, frankly, pretty predictable. Retaliation. America's closest trading partners hit back immediately. Canada, for example, rolled out a massive $155 billion tariff package. At the same time, China slapped its own huge tariffs on U.S. goods and specifically went after our agricultural imports, which just doubled down on the pain for farmers in places like Colorado.
And it wasn't just individual countries taking action. Global institutions like the World Trade Organization were sounding the alarm, basically warning that this escalating tariff war was putting the entire global economic recovery at risk. Which leaves us with this one crucial question. The whole justification for this policy was to protect and bring back American manufacturing. But with legal challenges popping up at home and fierce retaliation coming from abroad, the final result is anything but certain. So, are we seeing the dawn of a new era for American industry, or are we just watching the opening shots of a long and damaging global economic war? The next chapter is still being written.